What if the very thing you thought was your safe haven turned into your greatest threat? For Miles, the Appalachian Mountains were meant to be his escape, his sanctuary from the horrors of war. But when a buried secret from the past rises to the surface, everything he's worked to forget comes crashing down. The hunt begins, but it's not just his life at stake. It's the world-changing truth buried within a hard drive. If you're enjoying this, don't forget to subscribe and share where you're watching from in the comments. Miles, a black veteran, and his dog Cato ventured into the Appalachian wilderness, the thick fog of morning still clinging to the trees around them. Miles had come to the mountains to escape the ghosts of his past, to bury the memory of battles fought on foreign soil. Here in the forest's embrace, he found a fragile peace silence so deep that even the weight of his memories seemed to lighten. Cato, his loyal German shepherd, was his only companion. They were a team more so than Miles had ever been with anyone. Cato's sleek coat, a mix of dark brown and black with a touch of tan, was a stark contrast to the green and gray of the wilderness. But it was his sharp amber eyes that Miles trusted most. In many ways, Cato was the one thing in his life that remained constant. They walked the woods in harmony, Cato guiding the way and Miles keeping pace rifle in hand, though he rarely needed it. The day had started like any other. Miles was content to follow the old trails moving through the brush, listening to the occasional call of a bird or the distant rustling of leaves. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, a reminder of the rain that had passed through earlier in the night. He glanced down at Cato, whose posture had changed. The dog's tail was stiff, his body-rigid eyes scanning the underbrush, ears perked. It wasn't like Cato to be this alert. Miles slowed his pace, his instincts kicking in. "What is it, boy?" he muttered under his breath, watching as Cato's head swiveled back and forth. Without warning, the dog bolted into the thicket, pulling Miles off balance as he was dragged toward the ravine. It wasn't just a simple chase. There was something else in Cato's movements, something frantic, desperate even. Miles hesitated, caught between curiosity and caution. He trusted Cato more than anyone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Cato, however, had already made up his mind, and Miles followed, pushing through the underbrush. As they moved deeper into the forest, the familiar sounds of wildlife faded. The forest was unusually quiet now, a heavy stillness hanging in the air. Miles's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the creeping sense of dread that had settled over him. The dog's sudden change in behavior wasn't a random occurrence, it was a warning. They reached the edge of a ravine where the trees seemed to part, revealing something dark and twisted in the midst of the greenery. It was a wrecked Apache helicopter, half buried in the earth, its metal frame mangled and contorted as if it had crashed there long ago. Vines and moss covered much of the wreckage, nature's attempt to reclaim what had once been a symbol of destruction. Miles stood frozen, staring at the wreck. How did this get here? This was no ordinary crash site. He had seen enough of these in his time on battlefields in foreign countries, but this one hidden in the depths of the wilderness was different. It felt wrong, out of place, as if it had been left there specifically for him to find. His fingers brushed the edge of the wreckage, his mind racing. How had it gone unnoticed for so long? The site seemed untouched, preserved by time and isolation. The first twist came then as Miles noticed Cato's behavior. The dog had stopped barking and was now eerily silent, his body tense as he sat at the base of the wreck. Cato's nose twitched as he sniffed the air, his eyes fixed on a specific spot near the helicopter. Miles crouched beside him, placing a hand on Cato's back, trying to reassure both himself and the dog. It was then that Miles noticed something strange. The wreckage was not just a crash site, it was a tomb. A sense of foreboding crept up his spine as he realized the true weight of what he was standing in front of. The silence was oppressive, and as Miles peered closer, he could just make out something hidden beneath the twisted metal, something buried just out of sight. The second twist hit him when he uncovered a small, weathered compartment hidden behind a thick layer of moss. It was a compartment that seemed out of place, something that didn't belong in the wreckage at all. Miles's hand instinctively moved to the strap of his rifle, but he didn't draw it. Instead, his curiosity won out. Something deep inside told him he needed to see what was inside. Miles had spent countless nights wondering if the silence of the mountains could truly drown out the noise in his head. The haunting sounds of gunfire, the screams of soldiers, and the distant explosions had followed him here to this peaceful place in the woods, where the only sound should have been the wind rustling through the trees and the birds singing at dawn. He thought maybe, just maybe, that the mountains would offer him the peace he sought. But now as he stood there holding the hard drive, he knew that peace was an illusion. His life was about to change again. The discovery in the ravine wasn't just some random wreckage, it was a key to something much bigger, something dangerous. His eyes turned to Cato, who was sitting by his side, his body still tense, his ears perked. The dog was always in tune with his surroundings, more so than anyone Miles had ever known. Cato had been with him since his discharge from the army, a companion through thick and thin. Miles had rescued him from a shelter, and in return, Cato had saved Miles, grounding him when his mind threatened to spiral into the chaos of his memories. They had both fought battles of their own. Cato had survived the cruel streets of the city, and Miles had survived the horrors of war. Together, they had formed a bond that was unbreakable. Miles glanced at the hard drive in his hand again, the weight of it heavy in his palm. He didn't know what was on it, but he felt it in his gut that this wasn't just an ordinary file. This was something that could bring the past crashing back into his life with a force he wasn't ready to face. The past always had a way of catching up, and Miles knew better than anyone that you couldn't outrun it forever. He took a deep breath and looked around the clearing. The helicopter wreck was still there, a ghost from a different time, half buried in the earth. The vines and moss had started to grow over it, nature slowly reclaiming what had been left behind. It was a reminder of the destruction he had witnessed in his years of service. And now it seemed that destruction was waiting for him once again. His fingers tightened around the hard drive, and for a brief moment he wondered if he should just leave it. Leave it here in the woods, where no one could find it, where it couldn't cause any more trouble. But he knew better. He had spent years running from the past, hiding from the mistakes he had made, but it was never enough. The past always found a way to drag him back. And this time, the past had left him a clue. He couldn't ignore it, not when it was right in front of him, not when it could mean the difference between survival and something far worse. Miles turned to Cato, who was now standing his tail stiff and his posture alert. The dog sensed the tension, and Miles could feel the weight of it settling over him. "Come on, boy," Miles said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile silence. "We need to get back." But as he started to turn, Cato barked sharply, his eyes locked onto something in the distance. Miles froze his body, instantly going on alert. There was something out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. Miles could feel it, the prickle on the back of his neck, the unmistakable sensation that he wasn't alone. His hand instinctively reached for his rifle, but he didn't raise it yet. The woods were vast, and he'd been trained to trust his instincts. He scanned the area, his eyes darting from tree to tree, trying to spot any movement. But the forest was still too still. Miles felt the first stirrings of dread creeping in. This wasn't right. He slowly crouched down, motioning for Cato to stay close. The dog's growls were low now, a deep rumble in his chest. Miles motioned for the dog to be quiet, and Cato obeyed, his body tensed, ready to move at a moment's notice. Miles moved quietly through the underbrush, his feet barely making a sound as he approached the edge of the clearing. He stayed low, moving behind trees and thick brush to keep himself hidden. And then he saw it. A shadow in the distance. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but Miles's trained eyes caught it. Someone was out there watching. They were too far away to make out clearly, but Miles could see enough. The silhouette was tall, moving with the surety of someone who knew the land. The second twist hit him, then he wasn't alone in the woods. This wasn't just a random wanderer. This was someone who had been following him. Miles felt the weight of it hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just being paranoid, he was being hunted, and that meant everything had just changed. Cato barked once more, and this time it was louder, more urgent. Miles held his breath, praying that whoever it was hadn't heard them. The dog's bark had been sharp, but it hadn't echoed through the woods. It hadn't been an alarm. It had been a warning. Miles stood up slowly, moving behind the tree to keep his figure concealed. He had to think quickly. The person out there had been following them for some time, and that meant they knew he was here. They knew exactly where to find him. But Miles wasn't going down without a fight. He motioned for Cato to stay quiet and took a deep breath, listening intently. He had learned over the years that you never let your guard down. You never assumed you were safe, not in a war zone, not anywhere, not now. Miles made his decision. He wasn't going to wait to be ambushed. He would find out who this was, and he would do it on his terms. Miles moved swiftly, but cautiously, staying low in the thick underbrush, his eyes fixed on the shadow that had crossed his path. Every muscle in his body was on high alert. Cato, as usual, remained close by his movements, quiet, precise, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the forest. Miles had seen the way the dog's instincts had kicked in when danger was near, but today felt different. Cato was unusually still, his every sense engaged, watching for the unseen threat that Miles knew was lurking just out of view. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Miles's breath was shallow as he considered his options. The hard drive was still tucked safely in his pack, its weight now feeling like a curse rather than a discovery. Whatever was on it, it had dragged him back into a world of danger he had hoped to leave behind forever. The shadow he had seen earlier had moved, but it hadn't gone far. Miles felt it, that gut feeling, telling him that whoever was out there was no amateur. This wasn't just some hiker lost in the woods. This was someone who knew how to move, how to track. Someone who had been following them, watching them for a while. Miles's pulse quickened as he ducked behind a thick trunk, trying to stay hidden in the forest's dense cover. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. One wrong move and they'd be on him. The figure in the distance hadn't given any indication of knowing he was there yet, but Miles wasn't about to take any chances. He stayed crouched, waiting for the slightest sound, the slightest movement. The woods, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like a cage closing in around him, and the worst part, he didn't know who he was up against. It could be anyone. Mercenaries, an old enemy from his time in the military, or someone new. He couldn't afford to take risks. Cato's low growl broke the silence, drawing Miles's attention back to the task at hand. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on something ahead. His ears perked up, listening for sounds that Miles couldn't hear. Miles motioned for Cato to stay quiet. They had to move, but they had to be smart about it. Staying here was a mistake. The longer they waited, the more exposed they became. They couldn't risk being cornered. Miles made the decision to move. He and Cato crept through the underbrush, sticking to the shadows as best as they could, using the trees and thick foliage for cover. The sound of the wind through the leaves was the only thing that kept the silence from suffocating them. Every few steps, Miles would stop, listening for any hint of movement behind them. Nothing. Whoever it was, they were either good at staying hidden or hadn't realized they were being tracked. Cato stopped again, this time sniffing the air with his usual intensity. Miles motioned for him to stay. Something was off. He could feel it. He had learned over the years that in situations like this, every instinct mattered. Miles checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready, then slowly made his way forward, following the dog's lead. The forest around him seemed to breathe the quiet hum of nature, drowning out everything else. But that feeling of being watched never left. As they neared a small clearing, Miles heard footsteps, soft but deliberate. Someone was out there just ahead of them. Miles's hand tightened around the rifle's stock. It was time to confront the threat. He motioned for Cato to stay once again, and his voice barely a whisper. "Stay close." Miles took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to happen. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. This was about survival. He needed to be fast, decisive. As he approached the clearing, he saw the figure again. A man, just a silhouette in the dim light filtering through the trees. The man didn't notice Miles yet, but the way he moved, slow, deliberate, told Miles he was aware of his surroundings, always alert, always on guard. Miles kept his distance, watching the man for any signs of hostility. He needed information. Who was this person? Why had they been following him? Miles didn't have long before the man would notice something was wrong. He had no idea if he was out here alone or if more people were waiting in the shadows. Cato's growl deepened again, and this time Miles didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, rifle raised, his body moving fluidly through the clearing, his gaze never leaving the man. "Who are you?" Miles called out, his voice steady, but laced with authority. The man froze, then slowly turned to face him. There was a moment of silence, the two of them locking eyes. Miles could see the surprise in the man's expression, quickly replaced by something harder, more guarded. He was ex-military. Miles could tell there was something in the way he carried himself. The man didn't speak immediately, instead, sizing Miles up his own rifle hanging loosely by his side. "You're not supposed to be here," the man finally said, his voice gruff but controlled. "Neither are you." Miles shot back, his grip tightening on the rifle. "What's your business?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked to Cato, who was still watching him intently, his muscles tensed, ready to spring at a moment's notice. The dog was a reminder that Miles wasn't alone out here, and he was damn well prepared to fight back if necessary. Finally, the man spoke again, his tone softer, almost regretful. "I'm just doing my job, but I didn't expect you to be here." "What job?" Miles demanded, his suspicion growing. The man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. "You're holding something you shouldn't have," he said, his voice low. Miles felt his heart skip a beat as the man's words hit home. The hard drive, the one he had found in the wreckage. The secret he wasn't supposed to know. "What do you know about it?" Miles asked, his voice tight with urgency. Miles stood in the clearing, the weight of the hard drive in his pack suddenly feeling much heavier. He had hoped for some form of clarity, a simple answer to who this man was and why he was following him, but the encounter had only deepened the mystery. The man before him had said too much, yet nothing at all. "I was supposed to find it," the man had said, his words lingering in the air like smoke. Miles couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something he was never meant to uncover, that this wasn't some random chance encounter, but the beginning of a long, dangerous road. The man was standing a few feet away, still watching Miles with those cold eyes, waiting for him to make the next move. Miles kept his rifle pointed low, his grip firm, but not threatening. There was a part of him, however, that wanted to pull the trigger right then and there, just to be sure the man wasn't going to make a move. But that wasn't the answer. Miles needed information. "What is it you want from me?" he asked again, his voice sharper this time with more authority. The man didn't respond right away, his eyes flicking over to Cato, who was still standing guard beside Miles, his body tense and watchful. For a moment, it seemed as if the man was sizing them both up, considering his next words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper, as if he didn't want the forest itself to hear. "I don't know what you're tangled up in, but you've got something dangerous now. That hard drive, it's not just data, it's a key." Miles's heart sank at the words, a deep visceral understanding of what the man meant settling in his gut. The helicopter wreckage, The hidden compartment, the hard drive it had all been a part of, something larger, something far more dangerous than a simple crash. The man was right, he had found a key. But to what Miles' mind raced, trying to piece it all together. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The years he had spent trying to outrun his past, the guilt, the war, the things he'd seen it had all led him to this moment. It was as if fate had set him on a collision course with something he had no way of understanding. And now the hard drive was at the center of it all. The second twist that Miles hadn't seen coming was that this man wasn't just an enemy or a threat. He was a messenger, a warning. Whoever had been looking for the hard drive had known that Miles was the one who would find it, that he was the one who would be drawn into the web. "Who's after it?" Miles asked, his voice low and steady. "Who are you working for?" The man took a step back, shaking his head slightly. "I'm not working for anyone," he said. "I'm just trying to stay alive." Miles felt a flash of anger rise within him. "Don't lie to me," he snapped. "You're involved in whatever this is, and now I'm involved too." The man's expression softened, and for the first time, Miles saw a flicker of something like fear behind the man's eyes. "You don't understand," the man said, his voice barely audible now. "This isn't just about a hard drive. It's about something much bigger, something that's been hidden for years. I didn't know what I was walking into, but now it's all catching up to me." Miles could feel his patience thinning, his hand tightening around the rifle as he took a step closer to the man. "What is it you're not telling me?" he demanded. "What's on the drive? What's the key to—" The man's eyes darted away for a moment, as if he was trying to decide whether or not to trust Miles. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "It's a list of names, people who were involved in a military operation that went wrong. Weapons deals, black ops missions. It's all connected, and it's all covered up. If that list gets out, it could destroy everything." Miles felt the air leave his lungs as the weight of the man's words hit him. This wasn't just some forgotten piece of technology. It was a map to a conspiracy, one that had been buried hidden from the world for years. And now somehow Miles had stumbled upon it. Cato, sensing the tension, growled softly at the man. Miles looked down at his dog, then back at the stranger. "And what do you want from me?" he asked, his voice calmer now, though still filled with a hard edge. "I'm not here to make deals," the man said, his voice filled with urgency. "You need to destroy that drive. You can't trust anyone with it. People have died for less." Miles took a slow breath, his mind spinning. It was clear now this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was a warning, and it was one he couldn't ignore. The man was right. The drive was dangerous, but it was also the only way to expose what had been hidden for so long. Miles glanced back at Cato, who was still watching the man carefully. He had no choice now but to follow this path, no matter where it led. "I'm not destroying it," Miles said firmly, the decision settling in his chest like a stone. "I'm going to find out what's on it, and when I do, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." The man's face twisted into something between a grimace and a bitter laugh. "You don't understand. You're already in too deep. There's no way out." Miles stared at him unflinching. "Then I'll burn that bridge when I come to it." The man said nothing, just stood there staring at Miles as if weighing whether or not to believe him. Finally, he nodded once the briefest of acknowledgments. The next morning arrived cold and quiet, the sun barely cresting the peaks of the Appalachians, painting the forest floor in soft golds and deep shadows. Miles, with Cato by his side, left the cabin as if it were any other morning. But nothing was the same anymore. The world outside felt different, more dangerous. The hard drive still sat in his backpack, its weight now a constant reminder of the secret he was carrying and the target he had unknowingly become. Miles tried to push away the thoughts racing through his mind. He needed to focus. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now, not after everything that had happened. The man in the woods had given him a warning, but that was all. It was a warning. Miles wasn't going to back down. The truth had to come out. He wasn't sure what exactly was on the hard drive, but whatever it was something big, something that could change everything. It had taken years of running and hiding to get to this place, and now it seemed that the truth had found him instead. He knew that walking away wasn't an option. Cato sensed the change too, staying unusually close as they trekked through the woods. The dog's head was constantly moving, his ears alert, his body low, and poised ready for action. Miles had never trusted anyone more than Cato. The bond between them was simple and unspoken. They were both survivors, each dealing with their own scars. But now Cato was more than just a companion. He was Miles's partner in this. Miles's hand rested lightly on the rifle slung across his back. It was old, reliable, a piece of his past, but it had served him well. He hadn't fired a shot in months, but the weight of the gun was familiar. The calm before the storm had always been fleeting, and now it was gone. Every step felt like it brought them closer to something Miles couldn't control. The mountains, once a refuge, now seemed like a labyrinth of danger. As they made their way deeper into the forest, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The man in the woods had been right. Someone was after the hard drive, and that someone would stop at nothing to get it. The first hint of trouble came just before midday when Cato stopped. Suddenly, his nose twitching, his body coiled in a way that made Miles freeze. Miles didn't need to ask. He already knew. Cato's posture said that all danger was near. Miles motioned for Cato to stay low, crouching behind a large boulder as they both waited, listening. The forest was eerily silent now, every sound amplified in the stillness. Miles's heart pounded as he scanned the trees around them. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved him. It was the realization that they were being followed. Someone had picked up their trail. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was fact. And it was only a matter of time before they were surrounded. He couldn't risk being caught off guard. Miles tightened his grip on the rifle and motioned for Cato to stay close. "Stay sharp," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the dog even needed the reminder. Cato was already on edge, his amber eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. Miles felt his breath catch as a shadow moved in the distance. Someone was out there. They had been tracking him, and now they were closing in. He needed to make a decision fast. His options were limited, and the clock was ticking. He could run, but running wouldn't solve anything. It would only prolong the inevitable. They would catch up to him eventually. He needed to face this head on. Without a word, Miles began to move, staying low and following the contours of the land. He could hear the faint sounds of footsteps behind them, too soft for most people to notice, but not for Miles. They were moving quickly, deliberately, staying just far enough to remain unseen, but close enough to track him. He had to get ahead of them. They couldn't know he was aware. Miles made his way up a small ridge, hoping to get the high ground using the terrain to his advantage. Cato followed without hesitation, his paw steps quiet but swift. As they reached the crest of the ridge, Miles paused for a moment, scanning the area below. There, in the distance, he could see a figure moving through the underbrush not far from where they had been earlier. The figure was too far to make out clearly, but Miles could tell it was a man. Miles knew they were getting closer. This was it, the moment where things would change forever. Miles didn't hesitate. He slid behind a tree, keeping his movements as quiet as possible. His heart was pounding now, but his mind was focused. The moment was approaching, and Miles was prepared. The figure below stopped for a moment, scanning the forest around him. Miles could feel his pulse quicken, knowing that it was only a matter of time before they would be discovered. The man was too close. Miles needed to act fast. In one fluid motion, he moved from behind the tree rifle, raised, aiming for the shadowed figure below. Cato was already moving beside him, his body low, ready to strike. The seconds felt like hours as Miles took in the sight of the man below. He wasn't sure if the man was one of the mercenaries or just another unsuspecting soul, but it didn't matter. Miles couldn't afford to take any chances. The man below turned startled by the sound of a twig snapping underfoot, his eyes locking onto Miles. It was too late. Miles had already made up his mind. He didn't fire. He wasn't here to kill. But he needed answers, and he needed them now. Miles shouted down to the man, "Stop right there." The man froze, his hands raised slightly, a gesture of surrender, but his eyes were filled with uncertainty. "Who are you?" Miles called out, his voice steady, demanding. The man didn't move for a moment, but Miles could see the wheels turning in his head. He was calculating his next move. "You shouldn't be out here," the man said, his voice shaky, but his words were clear. "What do you want?" Miles repeated, his voice cutting through the tension. The man sighed, lowering his hands slowly, his eyes flicking to the rifle Miles still held. "I didn't mean any harm," the man said, "but you're in the middle of something you don't understand. You need to turn back before it's too late." Miles didn't believe him, but he needed to hear more. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone demanding. The man's gaze shifted nervously, his eyes darting between Miles and Cato, as if considering how much he should reveal. Miles kept his rifle trained on the man, his mind racing, trying to piece together the puzzle. Every answer the stranger gave only raised more questions, and yet Miles couldn't afford to waste time on the unknown. There was too much at stake. "Who are you working for?" Miles asked, again, his voice sharp, cutting through the growing tension. The man didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting between Miles and Cato, his posture tense, as if he was trying to decide how much to say. "I'm not working for anyone," the man finally said, his voice filled with a strange mixture of resignation and fear. "I'm just trying to survive, same as you." Miles didn't believe him for a second, but he couldn't afford to waste time on a man who wouldn't give him a straight answer. "Then what are you really after?" Miles demanded, his voice steady but insistent. The man glanced over his shoulder, as if checking for any sign of movement before looking back at Miles. "It's not just about the hard drive," the man said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "It's about the list." Miles's pulse quickened at the mention of the list. The hard drive, the helicopter wreckage. It was all starting to make sense now. Whoever had been watching him, whoever had been tracking him, had been looking for something specific, and now they were getting closer. "The list," Miles echoed, his voice low. "What list?" The man hesitated again, his eyes flicking nervously to the surrounding woods. "It's a list of names, military personnel contractors, people involved in covert operations," the man explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the kind of information that could bring down entire governments if it ever got out." Miles felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He knew that whatever was on that list, it had the power to destroy lives, his life included. "And who's looking for it?" Miles asked, his voice tight with urgency. The man shook his head, his eyes filled with frustration. "I don't know, but whoever they are, they'll stop at nothing to get it. And they'll come for you too once they realize you have it." Miles didn't flinch, his focus unwavering. "I'm not running," he said, his words coming out sharper than he intended. "I'm not hiding from this anymore. I want to know who's behind all of this." The man seemed to study him for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to tell him the truth. Finally, he spoke again, his voice filled with a quiet desperation. "You really want to know? Fine. There's a group. They're not just mercenaries, they're a private military company. Aegis Tactical Solutions. They're connected to everything. Weapons Arms deals covert ops. They pull the strings behind the scenes." The name sent a jolt through Miles. Aegis Tactical Solutions. He had heard rumors, whispers in the darker corners of the military world about shadowy organizations that operated outside the law, funding wars and conflicts to line their pockets. But hearing it out loud, now knowing that Aegis was involved in this, sent a chill straight through his bones. "And you think I'm involved with them?" Miles asked, his voice steady, despite the storm brewing in his chest. No, the man said, quickly shaking his head. But they'll think you are once they find out you've got the list. They won't care what you know or don't know. They'll just want it back. Miles glanced at Cato, who was still standing by his side, alert and ready. The dog's unwavering loyalty only reinforced his resolve. If anyone was coming for him, they would have to go through both of them. "What do you want from me?" Miles asked, his voice low but firm. "I'm not going to hand it over." The man's gaze softened for a brief moment, and he took a hesitant step forward. "I'm not asking you to, but you need to understand that you're not just in danger. Your life doesn't matter to them. But the people on that list, those names, those are the ones they'll go after. If they find out you have it, they'll come for you and everyone you care about." Miles felt a weight settle in his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. He had walked into a trap, and now he was caught in the web. "You should go," the man added, his voice barely above a whisper. "Take the list, leave this place, and disappear. It's the only way you'll survive." Miles stared at him, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "Disappear after everything that's happened? You think I can just disappear?" The man didn't answer, his eyes dark with something Miles couldn't quite place, guilt, fear, maybe both. But Miles knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something much bigger than himself. The people on that list weren't just names, they were victims' pawns in a game that Miles had unwittingly stepped into. "I'm not going anywhere," Miles said, firmly, his resolve hardening. "And neither are you." The man looked up at him, his expression a mixture of resignation and surprise. "You're not going to run?" he asked, his voice low. "Not anymore," Miles replied, his voice steady. "I'm not going to hide from this. I'm going to find out who's behind it, and I'm going to stop them." The man seemed to hesitate for a moment, then gave a grim nod. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone filled with a quiet sadness. "But I understand." "You don't get to tell me what I should do," Miles said, his voice sharp. "I'm not backing down now." The man took a step back, his shoulders slumping as if he had expected this outcome. "Fine," he said, softly, almost regretfully. "Just know that once you've crossed that line, there's no going back. You'll be a target, and there will be no one to help you." Miles didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man was right about one thing: once he crossed that line, there would be no turning back. But Miles wasn't afraid of the fight anymore. He wasn't afraid of what came next. He had been running from his past for too long. And now he was ready to face it head on. With Cato at his side, Miles took a deep breath and began to move forward. The hard drive was still in his pack, a symbol of everything that had brought him to this point. Miles couldn't shake the weight of the stranger's words as he and Cato made their way deeper into the forest. The man had told him that crossing this line would mean there was no turning back, but Miles had already made up his mind. He had known for a long time that there would come a point when running away wasn't an option anymore. That moment had arrived. As they moved through the woods, the quiet was almost deafening. The only sound, the crunch of their footsteps on the underbrush and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Miles had once found peace in the stillness of the forest, but now it felt suffocating. The air was thick with the realization that danger was closing in from every direction. The hard drive in his backpack was no longer just a file. It was a ticking time bomb. The list on it held the names of people who had been involved in dark, secretive operations, and whoever was behind this conspiracy would stop at nothing to keep it hidden. Miles could feel the eyes of Aegis Tactical Solutions on him already. He had no idea who was out there, who was watching him, but he knew they were out there. The forest had once felt like a sanctuary, but now it was a trap, a maze of trees and shadows designed to conceal his every move. The deeper they went, the more isolated they became, and the more dangerous the situation became. Cato, as always, was by his side, his every sense attuned to the surrounding environment. The dog was a silent sentinel watching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger lurking in the darkness. Miles had learned to trust Cato's instincts above all else. The dog had been with him through the darkest moments of his life, and now they were in this together. As they moved through the thick forest, Miles couldn't help but think back to the moment he had found the helicopter wreckage. It felt like a lifetime ago, but it had only been days. The discovery of the hard drive had set everything in motion, dragging Miles into a conspiracy that he never could have anticipated. He wasn't sure who was pulling the strings, but it didn't matter anymore. He had to find out. He had to see this through, no matter the cost. And yet the more he thought about it, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He was no longer just a man trying to survive in the woods. He was a target hunted by forces far bigger than he could imagine, but there was no turning back now. As the day wore on, the sky began to darken, and Miles knew they had to find shelter soon. They couldn't keep moving in the open for much longer. It wasn't just the elements that posed a danger, it was the men after him. Whoever they were, they had been tracking him, and now they were getting closer. Miles had to make sure he stayed ahead of them. The woods were a vast, untamed wilderness, but Miles knew it like the back of his hand. He had spent years in these mountains, learning every trail, every ridge, every hidden corner. But now, the very land that had once been his refuge felt like a maze, each twist and turn leading him deeper into danger. Miles slowed his pace, scanning the area as he moved, listening for any sign of pursuit. The sound of the wind was the only thing that broke the silence, and Cato's low growl was the only warning Miles needed. The dog had sensed something before Miles did, and it was clear that they were being followed. They weren't alone anymore. Miles paused, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle, his eyes narrowing as he searched the trees for any sign of movement. The feeling of being watched, that nagging sense of danger, was growing stronger. He had known this moment was coming, the moment when the chase would truly begin. The question was no longer whether they would find him. The question was how long he could stay one step ahead. Miles motioned for Cato to stay low, his breath steady as he crouched behind a thick tree trunk, his eyes scanning the forest around them. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming now, and Miles had to rely on every instinct he had left. This was no longer a hunt for survival. This was a fight for the truth. The seconds felt like hours as Miles waited, listening for any sign of movement. He could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the distance, the soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Whoever was following them was damn good, but they weren't as good as Cato. Miles had faith in his dog, and he knew that they had one advantage. They were moving on their terms. The pursuers weren't expecting them to fight back. Miles took a deep breath, his mind sharpening as he focused on the situation at hand. The first step was to get to higher ground. If they could find a vantage point, they might be able to spot their pursuers before being spotted themselves. Without a word, Miles motioned for Cato to follow. They began to move again, taking the high ground toward a nearby ridge. Cato, ever loyal, stayed close to Miles, his movements silent but swift. They moved with purpose, keeping to the shadows, staying low to the ground, careful not to make a sound. The closer they got to the ridge, the more Miles felt the weight of the chase pressing down on him. The harder it became to breathe. He had no idea how many people were after him. He had no idea what they were capable of. But he did know one thing for certain. If he was going to survive this, he had to stay ahead of them. They reached the ridge just as the last light of day began to fade from the sky. The view from the top was breathtaking, a sweeping expanse of trees and mountains stretching out before them. But Miles wasn't looking at the view. He was looking for any sign of movement below. He didn't have to wait long. In the distance, he spotted them, two figures moving through the trees slowly, deliberately. Miles's senses sharpened as he and Cato moved through the thick underbrush, every step calculated, every sound amplified. The ridge they had climbed provided a clear view of the area below, but it also exposed them to any threat that was lurking. Miles didn't like being in the open, but it was a calculated risk. They needed to know how close the enemy was. Below, the figures moved cautiously through the trees, keeping their distance, but clearly aware of something. Miles could see them scanning the environment, each step measured. It was like they knew he was out there, that they were getting closer to finding him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he stayed calm. Cato, ever loyal, was by his side, his amber eyes sharp, his body coiled in readiness. They were a team more than just a man and a dog. They were partners in survival. The first hint of danger came when one of the figures paused, turning his head slowly as if sensing something. Miles's breath caught in his throat. They weren't just moving through the woods anymore. They were hunting. The moment they realized Miles was on their tail, the game would change. The figures below didn't seem to know exactly where he was, but they were close enough for Miles to feel the weight of the hunt. The quiet had settled over them again, but this time it felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. Miles felt the shift like a predator's instinct kicking in. The forest was watching them. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, the forest holding on to the tension. Miles and Cato stayed motionless, crouched low to the ground, hidden in the shadows of the trees. The figures were still moving slowly, methodically, but they hadn't yet discovered Miles' position. Miles couldn't afford to take any chances. He had to make a move, and he had to make it now. The moment stretched out, and Miles felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the tension built. He motioned to Cato to stay quiet, then started to move down the ridge, taking careful, silent steps. His rifle remained at the ready, but he knew that it wasn't just about the gun anymore. It was about the hunt. The figures below didn't know it yet, but they were about to walk right into a trap. Miles had the high ground, but it wouldn't last long. The men were too skilled, too trained. They would figure it out. They would find him, but by then, it wouldn't matter. Miles was ready. He made his way down the ridge, staying low to the ground, using the terrain to his advantage. The wind had picked up, slightly rustling the leaves and branches, giving him just enough cover. He could see the figures below more clearly now, but he was still too far to make a move. The danger of being spotted was still high. He needed to get closer. Every step brought him closer to the confrontation, but Miles kept his movement steady and deliberate. He had done this many times before, but this was different. There was something personal about this chase. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about exposing the truth, and that meant playing the game on his terms. The figures continued to move, unaware of Miles's presence, but Miles knew the moment would come when they realized they were being hunted. When that moment came, he would be ready. The second twist came just as Miles made it to a cluster of dense trees. He had hoped to stay ahead of the men, but as he crouched behind a thick oak, he saw one of the figures pause, his eyes darting to the trees around them. Miles's stomach dropped. They weren't just searching anymore, they were hunting. The moment the man realized Miles was nearby, it would be a matter of seconds before the rest of the team closed in. Miles had no time to waste. He moved quickly, silently positioning himself just behind a cluster of brush. The men below were focused, searching the ground, but Miles knew they wouldn't be fooled for long. His heart raced as he watched them split up. One of them began moving toward the base of the ridge. He was coming right for Miles. Miles's breath slowed his focus, narrowing to the man below. He had to act. He couldn't let them close in on him first. His fingers tightened around the rifle, the familiar weight of the weapon comforting in his hands. He adjusted his position slightly, making sure his shots would count. The man moved closer, his steps light but sure. He was getting closer to Miles's hiding spot. The air between them felt thick, charged with the imminent threat. Miles's eyes never left the man as he crouched, making sure the distance was just right. Every muscle in his body was coiled, waiting for the perfect moment. And then, as the man moved into position, Miles exhaled slowly, lining up the shot. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, a movement to his left caught his eye. Cato had sensed something before Miles had. The dog's low growl was barely audible, but it carried enough urgency for Miles to understand. They weren't alone. Miles's instincts kicked in. He dropped down, pushing Cato behind him, his rifle raised, ready to face whatever was coming. The first figure below had already turned, and Miles could see the second man moving toward the ridge, making it clear they knew they were being stalked. The second twist was a sharp, undeniable reality they had known all along. Miles's heart pounded as he scanned the woods around him. He had walked into a trap. The men had been leading him straight to this moment. His position was compromised, and they were closing in from all sides. But Miles wasn't ready to be the prey. He had one more card to play, and it was Cato. Miles let out a low whistle, and Cato responded immediately, charging forward with a ferocity Miles had never seen. The dog moved like lightning, taking down one of the men in a blur of motion, his jaws clamping onto the man's arm with a force that brought him to the ground. Miles fired a shot into the air, a warning, but it didn't stop the chaos unfolding before him. He fired again, taking down the second man who had been closing in on them. The sound of the rifle echoed through the trees, sending birds flying into the air in a frenzied panic. The third man was still too far to get a clear shot, but Miles wasn't going to give him the chance to close the distance. He moved quickly, using the cover of the trees to put himself between the third man and Cato, who was still restraining the first man. It was only a matter of time before the third man realized they were outmatched. Miles could see the fear in his eyes as he backed up, his hands raised in surrender. The man wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for Miles and Cato. And now Miles was in control. Miles stood over the third man, rifle aimed at his chest, as Cato kept his hold on the first man, his teeth still clamped down, ready to strike if needed. The mercenary was shaking his eyes wide, his breath ragged with fear. Miles could see the man's fingers twitching, as if he were trying to decide whether to make a move or not. The forest around them was eerily silent now. The only sound, the labored breathing of the men on the ground, and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Miles could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. This wasn't how he had imagined things going down. He had hoped to stay hidden to keep his life simple in the mountains, but it seemed the world had other plans. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something much bigger. And now, with the hard drive in his possession, Miles was trapped in a deadly game he had never asked to play. "What's your name?" Miles demanded, his voice low but firm. The mercenary on the ground didn't answer immediately. He was trying to stay calm, trying to figure out a way out of this. Miles wasn't going to give him the chance to come up with a plan. I said, "What's your name?" Miles repeated, his tone more forceful this time. The man swallowed hard before answering, his voice shaky. "Derek." He muttered, his eyes never leaving the rifle aimed at his chest. Miles studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Derek, why are you chasing me?" Miles asked. "What do you want with the hard drive?" Derek's lips curled into a bitter smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You really don't know, do you?" he said, his voice filled with disdain. "You've got something that people like us would kill to get our hands on. Something that can bring down a lot of people, Miles." Miles's grip on the rifle tightened. The way Derek said his name sent a shiver down his spine. It was clear now. They knew who he was. They knew everything about him. "How do you know my name?" Miles asked, his voice steady, but filled with growing suspicion. Derek's smile faded, replaced by a look of resignation. "You think they don't keep track of everyone who's a potential threat?" he said, his tone a mix of bitterness and disbelief. "They know everything about you, Miles. They know your every move, your every breath. They've been watching you for months, maybe longer." Miles felt a knot form in his stomach as the realization hit him. This wasn't just about the hard drive anymore. This wasn't just about a list of names. This was about something deeper, something more personal. Whoever was behind this had been tracking him for a long time, And now, with the hard drive in his possession, they were ready to make their move. "I'm not giving it to you," Miles said, his voice low but resolute. He wasn't going to hand over the hard drive. He couldn't. The stakes were too high. "You don't have a choice," Derek spat, his voice filled with venom. "You're already in over your head. You don't know who you're dealing with. They'll kill you, Miles, and they'll kill everyone you care about." Miles didn't flinch. He had been through worse, seen more than most people could even imagine. He wasn't about to back down now. "I'm not afraid of them," Miles said, his eyes locked on Derek's. "And I'm not afraid of you." Derek's eyes flashed with anger, but Miles didn't give him the chance to react. In one swift motion, Miles stepped back, keeping the rifle trained on Derek as Cato released his grip on the first man. The mercenaries were still alive, but they were subdued for now. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger threat remained. They were still being hunted. Miles had no illusions about that. The moment they had made their move, the enemy would know they had been spotted. They would come for them again, and this time it would be a full-scale assault. "We need to go," Miles said, his voice sharp. "Now!" Cato barked once, as if in agreement, and Miles turned to move, keeping a careful eye on the two mercenaries as they struggled to regain their footing. He didn't want to kill them, at least not yet, but he couldn't leave them alive either. They were a liability, and Miles wasn't about to let them get in his way. But as he moved through the forest, a new sense of urgency settled over him. He needed to find a way to disappear to escape the trap that had been set for him. The forest, once his sanctuary, had become a maze of danger, and Miles knew that if he didn't act fast, he wouldn't survive the night. "Cato, stay close," Miles whispered, as the dog fell into step beside him. The two of them moved through the woods with the practiced silence that had been honed over years of living on the edge. They were used to this kind of life, used to running, used to hiding. But this time, it felt different. This time, they were running from something bigger than just danger. This was a fight for survival, and Miles knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to find answers. He needed to uncover the truth. Miles moved through the dense forest, his senses heightened as every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle of leaves a whisper of danger. He had been running for days now, the weight of the hard drive still heavy in his pack, a constant reminder of what was at stake. The chase had become relentless, but it wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't even about the conspiracy or the people behind it. It was about something more personal now. It was about redemption. It was about facing the choices he had made, the mistakes he had buried deep inside him. The hard drive with its list of names and dark secrets had forced him to confront his past in a way that no battle ever had. But now, with the mercenaries closing in with Aegis tactical solutions tightening the noose around him, Miles knew there was no more running. The path ahead was a narrow one, and it led into the heart of the storm. There was no escape anymore, no place to hide. He had known that the moment he made the decision to keep the drive, to expose the truth. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He had hoped that the woods, with their wildness and isolation, would offer him a chance to disappear, to slip away into the quiet of nature. But the forest had become a battleground, the trees mere specters of safety, and the silence now an oppressive force. He glanced down at Cato, whose amber eyes were fixed on him, steady and unwavering. The dog had always been his anchor, his constant companion, the one who had saved him time and time again from the darkness inside. But now, it wasn't just about survival for Miles. It was about the loyalty and bond they had built over the years. This wasn't just a fight for his life. It was a fight for the truth, for those whose names were on that list, for the ones who couldn't fight anymore. Miles had come to the mountains to escape his past, to find peace in the wilderness. But what he had found was a truth he couldn't deny. The lies, the corruption, the bloodshed, it was all connected, and now it was his responsibility to stop it. The figures from the mercenary group had tracked him relentlessly, but they didn't understand. They didn't understand what he had been through, what he had lost, or what was at stake now. They were pawns just like the rest of the people on the list, the ones who had been sacrificed in the name of power, of profit, of war. But Miles wasn't going to let it continue. Not anymore. Cato's low growl broke Miles from his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. He glanced up, and his eyes narrowed as he saw the more mercenaries moving through the trees, their weapons raised, their eyes searching for him. Miles's pulse quickened, but he didn't hesitate. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. Not this time. The time for waiting was over. He turned to Cato, who was already positioning himself by Miles's side, ready to fight, ready to defend. Miles took a deep breath, steadying himself as he gripped the rifle tighter. He didn't need to be a soldier anymore. He didn't need to rely on the training or the tactics. This wasn't about warfare. This was about justice. This was about making sure that the truth had a chance to be heard, no matter the cost. He moved forward, staying low, moving with precision, trusting Cato to guide him. They were a team, and they had always been stronger together. Miles had learned that the hard way. But now the bond between them was more than just companionship. It was a promise to fight, to stand together in the face of whatever came. He could hear the mercenaries closing in their footsteps, getting closer, their voices too loud in the stillness of the forest. Miles's heart thudded in his chest, but his mind was clear. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything would come to a head. He raised his rifle, his eyes locking onto the nearest figure. The mercenary didn't see him until it was too late. Miles fired the shot, ringing out in the quiet forest, and the man dropped to the ground without a sound. The rest of the mercenaries scattered their movements, frantic, as they tried to figure out where the shot had come from. Miles moved quickly, staying hidden, using the trees and the terrain to his advantage. Cato was already on the move, his speed and agility making him a blur in the shadows. Together they worked as one, taking down mercenary after mercenary, each shot deliberate, each movement calculated. It wasn't about killing, it was about stopping them. It was about protecting the truth that had been buried for so long. As the last of the mercenaries fell, Miles stood in the clearing, breathing heavily, his rifle still at the ready. The silence that followed was deafening. The fight was over, but the battle for the truth was just beginning. Miles looked down at the hard drive in his pack, feeling the weight of it once more. It wasn't just a key to the conspiracy. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for, everything he had lost. He had made it this far. And now he was going to make sure the world knew what had happened, what had been hidden in the shadows for too long. The silence of the forest enveloped him, but it wasn't a quiet peace. It was the calm after the storm. And Miles knew that no matter what came next, he was ready. He had taken a stand, and no one could take that away from him. With Cato at his side, Miles began to move forward, determined to finish what he had started. They were no longer running, they were fighting for the truth. And the truth would find its way to the light no matter how dark the world had become. The end. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling content. Let me know your thoughts on the plot in the comments below, and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear how this story resonated with you.